Okay, everyone, let's make a start. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate that. I know you braved the weather, so much appreciate that. So I'm going to briefly introduce Lloyd. You all have on the website his amazing biography while he was provincial cabinet leader in Manitoba and then on to the federal government. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but I want to give you my personal view on why he's such an amazing leader in Canada's international reputation. I consider him on the same level as someone else I knew who had died a few years back, and that's John Humphreys, who was one of the drafters of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the reasons why I equate Lloyd with John Humphreys is that he was the most humble gentleman I've ever met when I was on sabbatical at McGill. And he was almost hesitant to discuss with me how he worked with Eleanor Roosevelt to actually work towards drafting the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And despite that, he still kept his profile, even though it became the Magna Carta of the world. And when I look at Lloyd and see the things that he has done, it is so similar in terms of the reach that he has had all the way. If you look at his bio from the time he was even as a provincial premier and even as the leader of a university in Manitoba, where he promoted and pushed for the inclusion of Indigenous students and tried to promote Indigenous reconciliation in Manitoba. But when he goes to the federal level, because I was one of his advisors and because I was also on exchange with the government, I began to realize he had an approach to issues which are very similar to John Humphreys, where he was determined, regardless of the no-sayers who basically said to him, it's not going to happen, it's never going to happen. He pushed for a treaty which eventually became the Landmines Treaty, which even though there was severe opposition, even within the government itself, and definitely within the other major powers in the world from the US and many parts of Europe, he persisted, and yet through his leadership and through his ability to get a coalition, not just of other experts, but civil society, he managed to produce something which was now equally of global reach, which I know one of the discussants is going to talk about after Lloyd speaks. So that's just one example. Another example which I was personally witnessing was his encouragement of having a discussion after the genocides in Rwanda in the Balkans, that somehow Canada could take a leadership in coming up with a new approach to international peace and security. And he pushed for a commission on intervention in state sovereignty, which eventually created the concept of responsibility to protect, which again has global reach. And if that was not enough, he was also one of the architects of eventually pushing for Canada to take a lead on establishing the International Criminal Court. Talk about a global reach. Now you know why I equate him on the same level as John Humphreys in terms of the Canadians who had a profound impact on the world, as much as the leader of Canada, who eventually did get a Nobel Peace Prize, Lester Pearson. And in my view, it should have been followed up with a Peace Prize for Lloyd Axworthy too, after he accomplished the Landmines Treaty. So with that, I would like to turn over to Lloyd to talk about his own biography in his own words, rather than me just saying how much I appreciate what he's done for Canada and the world.
Well, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? We're all set? Right. I thought I would sit here just because we can have a conversation. It's a kind of or afternoon where you can sort of just ruminate and reflect. And I just would really appreciate the opportunity that Errol and his center have offered to share, I guess, what I've spent 2.5 years trying to recreate. And I'd like to start because sometimes there's little triggers, that kind of get your mind working. And today I had a couple. This morning I had an email from a woman who was at one time a constituent of mine in Winnipeg South. And she had read the book, the early part of the book, where I had talked about my growing up as a child during World War II and how my father and uncles had spent 5 or 6 years dealing with the fascism and the horror of that war. And she wrote a note saying that she had never thought of it before, but that people like my father and others, and by the way, there were 1 million Canadians out of a population of about 12 million at the time who put themselves at risk. But she had never thought just how important they were in, she had grown up in the Netherlands during the war, and how the Canadian troops had been very much responsible for the liberation in that country, of which my father was one. And she just wanted to thank me. I mean, I don't know how you thank a kid for what their father's done. That's kind of reverse physics. But I was very touched by the fact that she took the opportunity of Remembrance Day to share that view and just how important it was to her. But she also ended it by she's saying that what gives her grief right now is how the efforts of so many Canadians and many others around the world is being squandered by psychopathic politicians and sort of ruthless oligarchs where greed is the motivation. And I think that we could turn this little conversation group into group therapy if we needed to, based on what happened a week ago. But the fact that she would take the time to write and say, in a way, that she hoped that that I thought of my father, and I did, on the same grounds of saying, there are times that when Canadians stood up, sometimes for the ultimate test. And just following that, about just 2 hours before I came over here, I received another email from one of my mentors, and it would be known to some of you who are students of international law, but Richard Falk taught me international law at Princeton way back when. And again, was the mentor for me about how establishing international law post that World War II was one of the important contributions we've made to trying to restrain the worst part of our psyche. And that, again, what a horrible dilemma we're in right now when we see so much of what had been built up, the architecture and the efforts over the years. And so I thought maybe just as a little bit of a thematic, sort of sponsored by those two sort of moments of bringing my own thoughts, to talk a little bit about what they were saying. And let me just sort of riff off the Richard Falk thing, because in his class way back when, it was when I learned about Raphael Lemkin. Do all of you know Raphael Lemkin? You should. He is one of those great heroes that Errol talked about who made a difference. He was a Ukrainian lawyer, Jewish background, who was able to escape the Nazi takeover of his country. He found sanctuary. Catch that word, sanctuary. He was one of those people that Donald Trump would never let into his country anymore. And in the outpost of Duke University, began to develop and work on the concept of genocide. He invented the words. I don't know if we ever get a chance, some of us, to invent words, but he had accumulated all the evidence that had been coming in from the Holocaust reports, and began putting forward, and out of that, along with Hans Lauterbach, another international lawyer, were the kind of intellectual giants leading to the Nuremberg trials, and where for the first time people were expected to hold accountable sort of individuals, that the international law system wasn't just a matter of statecraft or governance or protection of national interests. it became increasingly focused on people, individuals, and their risks and their security. And Raphael Lemkin at Duke University, with the support of some other faculty members and of students, began a campaign in 1944 to establish a Geneva Convention on genocide. And he, through the power of his personality and his entreaties and his lobbying, as you all know, after the Second World War, the United Nations finally passed a convention on genocide, holding it as one of the ultimate crimes against humanity. And I raise that because as I've been sort of meeting with different groups across the country during this book tour, the perennial, almost necessary question each time is, well, how do we make a difference? I mean, how do we do something? And I keep thinking back to Raphael Lemkin, of this lawyer who escaped sort of persecution in his own country of Ukraine, came to the United States, was given sanctuary as a refugee, and allowed to then become sort of a leading light in establishing a whole new concept of law and accountability and of probity, and was able to get the international community to pass a convention recognizing that. I think there's clearly an irony, isn't there, that when you think about both Hans Lauterbach and Raphael Lemkin came from Ukraine, but they're now being sort of subjugated by one of the worst dictators and invasions I think we've ever seen in our lifetime, and we hopefully can find a way to put an end. So you know, our history is not one of just grand cosmic sort of movements. It is really much shaped and developed through individual efforts, through people working through a sense of belief and a commitment, and with facts and using the in this case university as a basis for providing a change in the world. And I want to sort of give you that background because I think I think we're, as a country, as I feel that we're beginning to lose faith that we can make those changes. We're beginning to sort of fall back into whether it's a comfort zone or a convenient zone. That was just basically, let's go along and let's play it tight. I have to say, if you want to object later on when we're talking, please do. But I can't believe that the political leadership of this country's advice after the election of Donald Trump is to say, you know, what, me worry? Everything's okay. Nothing's wrong. It's just another sort of bump in the road. Come on. Who's going to stand up against the deportations of millions of people? Who's going to stand up for a climate that's out of control? Who's going to stand up for the human rights of women who have been totally disbanded? And I have one basic message. I could probably maybe want to stop there and to say, for God's sake, Canadians, I know we have to get along. We have to make sure that our trades and our economics are properly managed. But to think that somehow buttering up a psychopath is going to make a difference is simply whistling in the cemetery. And I really think that I hope at some point we'll have leadership in this country that will stand up and say that we Canadians have to be a voice for the issues that my father and others fought for in the World War II, of things that really designated our rights as individuals and humans to survive, to prosper. You know, the great Canadian philosopher has talked about the whole idea of the affirmation of ordinary life. That's what we're about. The affirmation of to be able to get up in the morning and know that there isn't going to be a policeman at your door. The right to get up to go to work and feel that you freely express yourself over a coffee break. That your kid has a right to go to school. That you'll have a right to enjoy nature that's not been despoiled or corrupted. You have a right to expect that from your elected representatives, your governments, the people you put into power, that power will be used to do some good things, not to enhance personal wealth or serve sort of the theocratic views of a sects of people who think that they have an answer how all of us should live our lives. And that is what I try to write about. And I write about it because I come from a history of faith. Growing up in the north end of Winnipeg, my family were United Church people. And Winnipeg, and the Wesley College, which became the University of Winnipeg eventually, was the hotbed in Canada of the social gospel movement. Now, people have forgotten all about that. That's part of one of our historical things that we don't pay any attention to in this country. But the social gospel was a basic philosophy of theology, a faith that said, you show your faith, you demonstrate your belief by what you do on earth to make it a better place. And what happens in heaven is something that is up for grabs. But the social gospel is that you have to apply yourself. And growing up as a youngster in Sunday school and as a teenager in youth groups and so on, the wonderful Lois Wilson, who was moderator of the United Church, who just died 3 weeks ago at the age of 94, was able to transmit to us as a group of kids growing up in the North End. And the North of Winnipeg was a wonderful place, but it wasn't easy living. And it was a working class area with a lot of poverty, with a lot of discrimination. I had school chums who found out that they had to change their name because their father wanted to be promoted at a downtown retail store. And being a Sawchuck was not any good. He had to become a Saunders. And the sense of humiliation that went with that for that 60-year-old just lived with me forever. You have no right to do that to people. You have no right to but we do it all ipso facto in this country, too often and in too many places. And so what I wrote about is to say how I found a pathway. It's not necessary for everyone, but it did the aspiration to get into politics is because that's where there is levers of power that can and will and should be used for making the world sort of into that affirmation of ordinary life that I think we all sort of instinctively understand. And the other influence that I write about, and again, it's I think there was an article in one of the newspapers yesterday about how Canadians have forgotten their history. But when I was 17 years old, going to high school, and our history teachers said we all had to show up the next Wednesday night at the Civic Auditorium in downtown Winnipeg to listen to a politician talk. Oh my goodness, 17 years old, and you have to live. Let me say, my genes were jumping in different directions at the time. But he then admonished that if I didn't show up, I'd lose 20% of my marks. So there's nothing like a little academic intimidation to get you on the right path. And who did I listen to that night was Lester Mike Pearson with his polka dot bow tie, who talked about what it meant to be a Canadian, and what it meant to be a Canadian diplomat, what it meant to how Canada had things to offer to the world because we had learned how to deal with different groups and diversities and respect each other. That was kind of the bottom standard that he worked on. And that we had that particular experience to bring to the rest of the world. And I came out of that listening to Mike Pearson with a couple of commitments. One, I really began to understand what it meant to be a Canadian. I began to take pride in the fact that we were different. We weren't Americans. We weren't offshoots of the Europeans and our indigenous people sort of probably had the truest sense of what it meant because they were much closer to the land than any of us. But there was something that was distinct. I'm not saying better, but just distinctive about who we were. And that furthermore, that to make sure that distinction and the privilege that it endowed could be properly and effectively used, you needed to have a political system that allowed that to be freely expressed and freely developed. And so as a result, it became sort of a, if you ever start at 17-year-olds thinking about what you might do, I began thinking, not such a bad idea. And of course, I think one of the great serendipitous things is that after that meeting, some 30 some odd years later, I became a foreign minister of Canada, kind of representing the same spot that Mike Pearson did. And I never forgot that, because I felt that I was reliving his legacy and what he had established for people since then. And that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted people to know that those experiences are important as Canadians, that we have a history, we have an experience, we have a vocation, and that it's important that we not lose it, and we not give it away, and we not surrender it, and we don't sell it, but that we actually begin to use it in a way. And perhaps as Richard Foulkes wrote to me in his email, he said, probably more than ever is that voice needed, and that we have to be able to stand up. And that means that there's got to be increasingly a generation of people who believe that politics is not simply a transactional spitball game in question period, but it is something in which you can step by step make a difference, live out your faith, and acquire, and the country becomes better for it. So what conclusion I come to? Well, as Errol said, I had an incredible opportunity because I went into politics. I see some former diplomats, and I have to say that when I became foreign minister, I was asked to address the incoming class of foreign service recruits who had all just sort of made their way through the fairly harrowing marathon of becoming a foreign service officer. And I had to confess to them in this age of transparency that after I finished graduate school, I applied to become a foreign service officer, and I didn't make the cut. And so I had to find my way through another route, which is to kind of climb the greasy pole of politics to get there, which is a somewhat sort of a more eccentric way of doing it. But I said, nevertheless, I'm here for better or for worse. There's all kinds of different pathways, to find the Wizard of Oz. But it did represent to me that here was an opportunity to work with an incredible group of men and women who had over the years become the Canadian sort of voice and presence abroad, but had also used that time to think of what to do with it. And I think one of the first things that came to my desk was the issue that this group and my predecessors in office, Andre Ouellette and Prime Minister Chrétien, have been working on, that Canada should take a role in working on supporting the land effort by the civil society and other governments to provide a treaty banning the use of landmines and all its things that went with it. And at the same time, one of my staff members, a young man named Mike Pearson, who was also a relative of you-know-who, drew my attention to the 1984 UN Declaration on Human Security. And we were fortunate because the Berlin Wall had fallen, the system was open, all the old conventions were now up for grabs. And so I said, let's look at human security. And all of a sudden, there was a click. Sometimes in your life, things go in your head. And I thought, what's a demonstration of human security? Is providing protection for people against the sort of incredible danger and risk of weapons sitting in the ground, unseen and invisible, that can rip your gut out or tear your head off. And so that became sort of we used the human security framework to talk about how Canada could play a role in in supporting the notion of signing a treaty, and that we could work directly with civil societies, the mine action people who were here and that Aaron Hunt now represents, that there was a fascinating political partnership that was developed. It hadn't really happened before. As the standard practice in politics was to consult with civil society, listen to them, and so on, but not to partner, to work together and actually try to sort of correlate and cooperate to the point that we became a very powerful influence and use the capacity we had as a government, to do the diplomatic in work, and the civil society could do a lot of the PR and the public diplomacy on the outside and get people mobilized. It was I like to call it kind of it was a diplomatic, for the first time, it was diplomacy by participation, or participatory democracy, to put another word around it. And it was that particular kind of vehicle that we began to work with, that without going through all the steps, because I do write about it, we ended up hosting in December of '97, thousands of people, 120 odd countries, large numbers of civil societies, the Campaign Landmines, the International Red Cross, the Handicap International, now Humanity Inclusion, all being partners to sign a treaty that established the banning of of the landmines, their exports, their production. And we woke up that morning and didn't realize that we had actually really contradicted and challenged the conventional way of doing things. And normally, these kinds of things went to disarmament commissions in Geneva, and there was all kinds of, I always said Geneva was the abattoir where good ideas go to die. And the result was that in many ways, we had found a way to make change. We had found a way to actually mobilize the common partnership of governments and people and institutions to make a fundamental difference in the way that people could be protected around the world. Not a bad concept. And here was something that is not often recognized. That the 2 weeks that were spent here in Ottawa with all those people, foreign ministers, prime ministers, presidents, NGO leaders, international institutions, it gave us as a Canadian government and as Canadians a chance to develop our own multilateral system, to develop our own network, to put together a kind of a correlation, a collaboration of all kinds of people who, and particularly with the Norwegians, a wonderful sort of partner that we had, we developed the Human Security Network. We actually, I know this sounds crazy, but it's true. We didn't wait to have something go through NATO or the UN. Right? We established our own multilateral group, and we established it as a basis of promoting human security. And after that, as Errol has pointed out, 8 months after we did the treaty on landmines, we were involved in helping to develop the Rome Statute on International Criminal Court. I mean, so here was Canada becoming a leader in a second effort to provide an institutional legal protection for people. For goodness sake, isn't that something? I mean, just think about it for a moment. Think about all the wrangling that goes on today. What's happening around the world today, where the civilians are just being mutilated and murdered without any. I mean, there's the collateral damage for women and children in this world is just sickening. And we allow dictators. We allow Putin to get away with it, and now we elect an American, or the Americans elect their own president, who thinks, well, there's nothing wrong with all that. Let Putin do what he wants. But we took a stand on it. And we followed through as Errol pointed out, perhaps some of the most interesting and significant and still very active concept called responsibility to protect. Because I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Toronto to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Kosovo independence. Kosovo, small place in the Eastern Europe, who after the breakup of Yugoslavia decided they wanted to have their own way of doing things. That didn't sit well with the Serbs, who were next door, and their leader Milosevic. And again, we became a leader in helping to establish, catch this, for the first time that I think it's true, the first time that an international coalition came together to use military means to stop an invasion and an aggression by a predator. And it worked. It didn't work without risk. I'm not saying that it was sort of easy peasy, but it actually worked, that we established that as a precedent, that the international community, through an ad hoc group, was able to stop the aggression and the sort of cultural extermination of a group of people. And again, I think through the smartness of people in our Foreign Affairs Department and some of our academics, and Earl was part of it, he was an advisor along the way. He said, but that isn't good enough. Just not good enough. That you can't do this on an ad hoc basis. You can't rely upon sort of putting sort of twine and chewing gum together to make something stick. You had to do something that had a longer term life to it. And that's when we established the International Commission on Sovereignty and Intervention, which after 2 years' work came up with the concept of responsibility to protect. And I think many of you here have studied it. I won't get into the details, but to me, it had three simple functions. Is that it was to hold individuals accountable, not the governments, but prime ministers, foreign ministers, generals, accountable that if power that they held was they were not willing to use to protect their people, or they couldn't use it because they didn't have enough of it, or they themselves were the predators, then the international community had a responsibility to protect. Ask yourself what that means today, when we need to provide protection not just against the conflicts and the aggressions, but the climate out of control and the devastation that goes with it. A famine is now sort of replete in 8 or 9 places around the world and gathering, where rights of people, especially women and children, are being totally ignored and treated as collateral damage. So I guess the case I want to make to you is that what I hope I was able to do sufficiently to relate just how that time as Canadians, we weren't standing in the barricades beating our chest, but we were putting together the best of our talents and our resources and our minds to actually helping create an international system that would provide greater protection for innocent people. And so one final word, I know I'm going long. It's kind of, I usually get the hook by this time. But at the end of the writing, I asked myself, what's missing? I mean, why are we out there? Is it simply because the world has changed? Well, the new configuration of multilateral sort of power blocks still has a place for protecting people. What was missing, I think, that we're not a whole country. That beginning in the 90s, with the Royal Commission on the Rights of Aboriginal People, we began to understand that we had committed one of the great lies and transgressions of history. That we had basically said in 1867, when we formed the constitutional framework for Canada, that we had 2 founding people, French and English, not 3 founding people, including the Indigenous community, who were here first. And how can you be a serious country? How can you think that you are really fully complete and capable when you ignore not only that history, but are still floundering in the ways of trying to correct that mistake? And that's why in the last part of the book, I have a proposition for you. That it's time as Canadians, step by step, we begin to restore and reenact the fact that our Indigenous community is a third founding community. They have the rights to go with it, and we can then derive huge value from their sense of legality, of ethics. Here's one issue. In this part of North America, the Iroquois Confederacy for centuries held the notion of a seventh generation principle. What is that? It is that any decision that the Iroquois Confederacy would make had to consider the impact, not just of children and grandchildren, but of their children and grand. You had to consider the impact of 7 generations ahead. Think for a moment. If that became a part of our governing ethos, if it became part of the governing principles, let's think what it would mean the way we respond to sustainability. How we respond to the issue of homelessness and poverty. All of a sudden, we're required to have a very different sort of marker and metric for ourselves. And so that's why I put the proposition forward. It wasn't mine. It was totally based on the kind of proposals that were coming from Indigenous leaders like Phil Fontaine and Murray Sinclair and others who had advanced those over the years. But I said it's finally time that somebody who's non-Indigenous stand up for it and try to get something implemented along the way. And that's where I ended, with a big mark, because I believe that if we as a country began to address that fundamental sort of chasm in our own history and restore it to a proper description of who we are and where we came from, that we'd be a much better country for it, and we'd be much better for the world, that we would be able to make the best of what the angels give us. And that's why I think I wrote the book, and that's why I discovered along the way some things about who we are, where we are, and where we should go. And I hope that when you get a chance, you might enjoy reading it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. So we're going to have some discussions, go over some of the points that Lloyd has raised. The first one is Erin Hunt, who is the Executive Director of the Mines Action Canada. She was very active on the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines since 2003 and has been working in humanitarian disarmament in various capacities since 2006. So I guess we can have Erin on screen right now and talk. Erin, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. If the folks on the stage could give me a thumbs up or a wave that you can hear me. We didn't have time for a sound check. Awesome. Thanks so much. And yes, thanks so much for having me, even though I am coming to you from Victoria, the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people. Even though I don't live in Ottawa, it's really always wonderful to be back at the University of Ottawa and talking about the Ottawa Treaty. So keeping in mind that this event is on campus, I sort of thought I'd want to focus my reflections on the book on key takeaways for students and young people who want to make change in the world. Yeah, I might have been a little bit in the mood for that group therapy session Lloyd mentioned at the start of his remarks. So let's get to it. So I was actually an undergraduate when I first met Lloyd at a conference on human security at UBC, a little bit, almost 2 decades ago. And I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have believed that we'd be sharing the stage in the future. So I think it's really important for young people to have a look at the book. And The book's coverage of this Ottawa process really highlights one of the things that you need if you want to change the world. And that's not, necessarily education and all of these things that you do need, but you definitely need courage. So the movement to ban landmines under the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which I'm a governance board member of, emerged from survivors who had the courage to share experiences and speak about the worst days of their lives. And then aid workers and deminers and human rights activists, teachers and medical personnel who were out there demonstrating the humanitarian impact of these lethal barriers to development. But what was needed was a decision maker who was going to be really willing to listen and then challenge the status quo. So luckily, Lloyd came into his role at the right time, and that he had the courage to try something a little bit crazy. As you heard in his opening remarks, he and the team did the unexpected, and it really paid off. But as you read in the book, this 1996 challenge for the world to come back to Ottawa in a year with a treaty was unpopular with other governments, even the ones who supported a ban at first. And then the process itself, including civil society that we've already heard about, that was a model that hadn't been tried before. Excuse me. So if you want to change the world, you really do have to be prepared that some people are going to be very unhappy because, change is hard and the status quo is easy. We definitely need more of that type of courage in foreign affairs right at this moment. I was so glad you brought up the line about the Convention on Conventional Weapons in Geneva, or known as the CCW, being the avatar of good causes. As someone who spent countless hours sitting in CCW meetings, my professional response is that's a really accurate description. My honest response was I laughed in such a snort laugh kind of way when I saw that line that I was very glad I was reading the book alone. The CCW, for those of you who don't know, is a consensus-based forum where states discuss all sorts of disarmament issues except for weapons of mass destruction. But unfortunately for all of us, the CCW understands consensus as meaning that every state of the limited number of states that belong to CCW has a veto. And I'm sure you can all imagine that there are states that want to delay and inhibit process on disarmament, especially in our current geopolitical situation. So Lloyd's invitation back in 1996 pulled that landmines issue out of the CCW. But at the moment, talks about autonomous weapon systems, so weapons that would use sensor data, artificial intelligence, and algorithms to select and fire upon targets, including people without human control. These talks are trapped at the CCW. For over a decade, Stop Killer Robots, which is a global disarmament campaign Matt co-founded, has been calling on states to negotiate new international humanitarian law to prohibit autonomous weapon systems before they reach the battlefield or the border or the riot squad. But for 10 years, discussions in CCW have been stymied by a couple states. So we really need a government and then like a foreign minister with the courage to pull this issue out of CCW so we can make progress. Unfortunately, Canada isn't willing to take the lead. Last month, Canada actually helped water down a resolution at the UN General Assembly to have a few days of more inclusive, all states welcome discussions on autonomous weapons under the auspices of the General Assembly. And not only that, Canada abstained from voting on a few paragraphs of the watered down resolution, including a paragraph that said, stressing the importance of the rule of humans in the use of force to ensure responsibility and accountability, and for states to comply with international law. Courage seems to be in short supply right now. But the Ottawa Treaty is a testament to what happens when courageous people with a shared goal work together. So I'm hoping we're going to see more of this courage from Canada in the future. So while the world does feel pretty terrible right now, there's no question that the Ottawa Treaty has made the world safer. So we have 164 states that have now joined the treaty. and only two of those states outside the treaty still actively use landmines. Casualties dropped from over 20,000 annually before the treaty to 4,710 in 2022. That's listed in the book. And the 2023 numbers are going to come out in 1 week, and I'm not allowed to spoil them, unfortunately. Since the treaty entered into force, 30 countries have been declared landmine free. So all in all, that's a lot of lives saved and land cleared. And that brings me to that one other thing that you need to change the world, and that's hope. You have to believe, as Lloyd and his team did on landmines or on the ICC and other topics, that a better world is possible, and you can contribute to it. And what's really important is that hope continues to be important, even when you don't win. And I think you can see that in the book too. There's this quote I love, and I think, Lloyd has embodied this in his career. It says that the only kind of fights worth fighting are those you're going to lose, because somebody has to fight them and lose and lose and lose until someday somebody who believes as you do win. In order for someone to win an important major fight 100 years hence, a lot of people have got to be willing, for the sheer fun and joy of it, to go right ahead and fight, knowing you're going to lose, and that you mustn't feel like a martyr. You've got to enjoy it. This is the quote that sits on my wall in my office here. And I've got to say, from the book, it does sound like, Lloyd, you've enjoyed the fights that you've been fighting. But for the rest of you, I do have good news. As you've heard, the Ottawa Treaty is an example of a win, and its success is showing other people what can be achieved. It gives everybody success, or everybody hope that we can make change. And it's a win because of the people involved, past, present, and future. It was really nice to see that the chapter on landmines ends with reflections on an event that Matt co-hosted along with Canadian Landmine Foundation and Humanity and Inclusion in 2022. And we sort of concluded that event with a video message from some of the fantastic young women from our Mine Action Fellows Youth Program. All of those young women are involved today in making sure that the Ottawa Treaty continues to win. Rosa from Azerbaijan is advocating for survivors and working tirelessly to get her country to join the treaty. Natalia in Colombia has actually been promoted, and now she represents her organization internationally, helping to share Colombia's success stories clearing mines with other organizations in Syria and Iraq, and I believe Ukraine now. Kendall works at the headquarters of a global demining organization, supporting their programs in multiple countries. While in Sri Lanka, Namaya is supporting that final stages of landmine clearance, and they're counting down the months until her country is landmine free. And Maria is teaching children how to stay safe from landmines and other explosive remnants of war amid the bombing and shelling in Lebanon. In less than 10 days, they're going to be among the 38 young people that we're bringing to attend the 5th review conference of the Ottawa Treaty in Cambodia. That's where states parties will be adopting an action plan to guide the next 5 years of work to finish the job that Lloyd and the team started here in Ottawa in 1996. So as you can see, you don't have to be a foreign minister to make change, although I would guess that it helps. So if you do want to help us finish the job on landmines, there's a few ways to get involved. You can share the information. As I said, the Landmine Monitor is coming out next week. So you can watch our social media and the website, which is so easy. It's the-monitor.org to get all the updated information about the landmine situation. Social science students at the University of Ottawa can do an international internship with us through the Faculty of Social Sciences. And we have community service learning opportunities. You can write your MP to advocate for Canada to fund landmine clearance and victim assistance. This is one of those wonderful issues that all 5 parties in the House of Commons strongly support, but they really should be putting their money where their mouth is, especially with their election coming up. And then at MAC, you can follow us online, you can share our posts, join our newsletter, or donate. We're at minesactioncanada.org. So to wrap up my my contribution to this discussion. I just like to note that, normally books like My Life in Politics come at the end of a career. I mean, I wouldn't actually put it past Lloyd to have something else up his sleeve that of what's next. But really, it is time for the rest of us to take up this fight. So I really encourage folks to read the book, muster up your courage and your hope, and let's get out there and make some change and enjoy fighting the good fight. It'll be fun to finish the job. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Erin, very much. That was great. In fact, your message is also the same message in the book and it's amazing that we're now doing it on Remembrance Day, where the message is we're passing over the torch to the next generation. So thank you, and hopefully your message will be heard also as is Lloyd's. So the next discussant is Margaret. Go next.
Sure.
And I just want to briefly describe Margaret. Margaret Jenkins is a co-director of the University of Ottawa's Gender, Peace and Security Collaboratory, as well as a senior fellow and professional in residence at the School of International Development and Global Studies. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lloyd, for being here and sharing this just important book that we should, as Erin referred to, use as sort of a toolkit, I think, a toolkit that we have at our disposal. I don't want to speak very long because I think it'd be nice to, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. It'd be nice to have a good Q&A and figure out how we're going to, what our next steps are all going to be here. But let me just take up sort of on the same thread as Erin's message, more on sort of how what Lloyd's done has inspired and in a concrete way led to I think, real achievements that are going on right now that we all use who work in the space of international peace and security policy. So it's clear from the book that, and Erin mentioned this, that Lloyd fought very hard with great persistence, with great determination, with a lot against him, a lot of headwinds, to get these accomplishments that Canadians still refer to. They're still household names. These are what Canadians still sort of carry around as the lore of what Canada's about. And we can talk about how long can we keep clinging to these, decades can't pass when we don't have something else like this to show. So there's that persistence part, but I think also threaded through the book, which is a key part of the work I work on in women, peace and security. This is a UN agenda, but it's global. Over 108 countries now have national action plans on women, peace and security. It piggybacks very much on the human security foundations that have been pushed forward by leaders like Lloyd. But very much threaded through the book is the importance of listening, consultation, and real consultation, like real at the table, working together in partnership. And I think when we're looking at success and what lessons to draw from this, which we should do because we need it to keep happening, is that I think Lloyd embodied this rare person who can be steadfastly determined at the end goal, but also an incredible listener and consultative. And I think this is a very big tension that you can carry with you in security, but in politics. And so that was really incredible to see how you do that. So I just wanted to mention that. And just also the importance of listening and consultation and partnership, including with civil society. And often that's thought as sort of the nightmare for the security sector. So we're constantly advocating for it and how it can be done. But in a time of shrinking space for civil society in a lot of the world, it's so important to have these instructive and positive examples of when that can be very positive and constructive and actually necessary, because you can't do security work. You can't know what people need, as you know, and it's threaded throughout your book, to feel secure and to have their security actualized. You can't do that without listening, without consultations, because you're just one person and you're a certain person and you're represented a certain way. And everyone is made vulnerable, of course, by different factors, right? So this need for consultation and the tension with that, with like the quick and fast and difficult security decisions that have to be made, but you masterfully have a lot of insight into that. Aaron talked about meeting Lloyd, I think a couple decades ago. I just want to also talk a bit about that. So I'll talk a bit about the impact on my work, as I mentioned, but also just me personally, which Lloyd won't be aware of. So it's also interesting. I'm here to talk about this. But so I graduated here from my master's at Carleton. I went on to do a PhD at the University of Toronto. I also spent quite a bit of time in the United States, over 10 years. I did my postdoc there. So there's a lot that resonates. I also grew up in the United Church. So there's a lot that resonated there. But what's interesting is after I defended my master's thesis, I had an internship in the UN at the UN headquarters at UNIFEM, which was a precursor to UN Women. So I had the car all packed up, ready to drive out of Ottawa. And then I remembered like that Carleton, once you defend your thesis, you get a free pint on the university. So I actually got out of the car, ran back upstairs. I wasn't driving, you'll all be relieved. I got in the car, drove straight to UN headquarters. And I realized from your book that, you know, you were a leader in sort of making these internships possible for young people. So, you know, I didn't even, that I stand on the shoulders of all these Canadian leaders who made these opportunities and possible. And I'm still committed to this work. I'm still committed to Canada. I'm committed to security for Canadians and Canada having this role. And a lot of this comes from this thread, and it's in Lloyd's book also, because he's connected to a speech when he heard when he was 17, right? So we just keep it going, and forums like this keep this going. But it doesn't stop there, because I arrived in New York, and it's Beijing +5 is around 2000. So it was a big, big event. And Lloyd Axworthy is foreign minister at the time. We have a seat on the Security Council. It was a great time to be at the UN as a Canadian. And we're all getting around talking about, well, how are we going to pull off this big event? Because UNIFEM was quite small and I was just an intern. But so lots of dignitaries were coming. The Clintons were coming. Hillary was on our panel. And so then they needed someone to volunteer to make sure people had their seats. Like the UN protocol was really nervous. And so I volunteered to kind of keep Lloyd Axworthy's seat for this somehow. Because he was attending a UNIFEM panel. And the protocol office, they drilled into me that I can't let this seat go to anyone else, and that you don't know what the UN is like, but there's going to be everyone coming up to you saying they're entitled to that seat because they're so-and-so and they're entitled to this seat. And you can't listen to them. That's Lloyd Axworthy's seat. So anyway, I got there, and sure enough, I'm nervous, and everyone's telling that I'm from this country and I'm Democratic Supreme Commander of this country or whatever it was. But so I'm trying to hold his seat. So eventually I decide the only way to do this is to sit down in Lloyd Axworthy's seat. So I sat down in his seat. I was like, I've got it. They're not going to move me out of the seat. But anyway, of course, he comes, and for some reason there was media taking pictures, and he's coming, and I'm kind of stuck in Lloyd Axworthy's seat because it's in the middle and there's people on either side. So I was like, this isn't really how it's supposed to go. Anyway, so then he came by, and I remember I scurried off, but he asked me who I was, and I said, oh, I'm Margaret Jenkins from Canada. I'm I'm Canadian, and I'm an intern here. And we shook hands briefly. And I remember he said, well, thanks for keeping the seat warm for me, you know. So it's kind of a funny story, and I thought of it when I read this book because it's ironic now because you've really kept the seat warm for all of us. And it's funny how things come full circle sometimes. But I'll just mention two quick examples from my own work where a human security lens is really, really helpful, and it's actually used. And, you know, Aaron talked about empirical realities, and they're very, very, very significant in the sense of the lives saved, you know, lives saved, people not getting harmed, people not going through the terror of landmines because of the landmines treaty. And those are empirical data. The norm shifting, the humanizing of security, okay, is always harder to measure, but it's very much shifted the landscape. And this is what we talk about, believing in these international norms and having them entrenched in people as they do work, because it makes all our work so much easier. And what we're facing right now is, of course, a re-questioning, a fighting of these norms. And that's why we have to stand up for them, because otherwise you're backpedaling. And I'll just give two examples. One, our paths didn't exactly cross. Again, I won't be so bold to say, but Lloyd Axworthy took up a fellowship, I believe, 2016 in Berlin, at the Bosch Stiftung Institute. So I was living in Budapest. I was a visiting professor there at Central European University at the time. And of course, I land there and the migrant crisis happens, which you talk about in your book. But I recall, you know, again, I had to meet for other reasons a high-ranking officer in the Hungarian military at that time about something else, about coming to my class and things like that. But I remember they were saying, and they asked me what I thought about the migrant crisis because everyone was talking about it. Budapest train stations were absolutely full. And Lloyd was, of course, in Germany, which was taking a complete opposite take to migrants as Hungary. It was Orban in power. We all know, I think, what Orban stands for. Even Trump is, I think, refers to Orban in a presidential debate. So anyway, she's asking me what I thought, and I'm sitting in the Hungarian military, you know, offices behind big barbed wire, and they actually had taken my passport, but it's an EU country. So I'm like, but it's never great in my business, and Lloyd has great stories about this in his book, to give up your passport. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but just earlier, that week, I'd gone to one of Orban's speeches where he traced the threat to Hungary from like the Habsburgs and the Ottomans and the whatever else, right to Central European University, George Soros, and to gender studies. I mean, how he did that is incredible. But as we know, fear-mongering has very loose connection to empirics. So anyway, I was a little nervous that I was sitting there and I'd handed over my passport. But she said, what do you think about this migrant crisis? And, you know, she's talking about security and all these things. It is the Hungarian military. And I just said, well, you can't have, there was that horrific photo of a boy who had washed up on European shore on the beach, you know, found by a soldier, traumatizing for everyone. You just can't have children washing up on the shores of Europe. You can't have it. And you can't have Hungarian soldiers throwing bread to people locked in cages. It doesn't matter, you know, that I could say that, and it wasn't so foreign to her. And I could say it there because we stand on the shoulders of norms like human security. It's like we can talk about security risks of migrants. There are security risks. Everyone has to think about how to control their borders. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about humanizing security. So you have to kind of, you know, so I really have Lloyd to thank for those that leadership and also my work in women, peace, and security. Just recently, we were debating language for the regional plan of action on women, peace, and security, and there was a lot of humming and hawing of how forceful we could make the language. And I just put out there, well, why don't we, everyone was getting tired, which is sometimes a good time. But I put, why don't we put out there just to consider to ASEAN member states, and other civil society was in the room, the eradication, the complete eradication of conflict-related sexual violence in the ASEAN region. Because we were trying to think, how do you ever give Myanmar anything that you can potentially talk to them about? And there's state-sponsored rampant sexual violence, which Lloyd mentions in the book. So this is a radically weird idea for this to just put out there, the eradication of something as if it's like a disease. But again, it's the human security lens, and it comes on the shoulders of people like Lloyd Axworthy, that because he showed it's within the realm of possibility to eradicate something, and we should have responsibility to use our voice, even if people think you're crazy. Why is that crazy? It's crazy to think we're not capable of eradicating something like that. So it's hard to do it alone, but when you have people who have done it and you're just remembering that things like this have been done, it's tremendous. It gives a lot of strength when, as he wrote so well about, it's hard sometimes to have strength. There's a lot of naysayers. So I will close on that note and just thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you, Margaret. And the last discussant is Stephen Briani, who is a professor at the Universities of Ottawa School of International Development, where he teaches and conducts research on the intersection of development and justice, particularly on the activism of persons with disabilities, gender, inequality, justice, and security sector reform. Over to you, Stephen.
Much, Lloyd. Sorry, Errol, and thank you, Lloyd. Can everybody hear me? So I'm also very honored to be commenting on this important book today on Remembrance Day, and here on unceded Anishinaabe territory. I had the good fortune, I don't know, Lloyd, if you'll remember this, but of meeting Mr. Axworthy in the late 1980s when there were wars raging in Central America. And I was part of a civil society initiative involving people in churches and universities, in unions, and so on, that were engaging officials and MPs in evidence-based discussions about what was really happening in Central America and the problems with the Canadian approaches, Canada's acquiescence to US policy at the time, and the need and the possibility of acting not just independently, but in concert with other middle powers in the hemisphere like Mexico, Colombia, and so on, that were starting to craft peace agreements in and with the region. That eventually led to Lloyd, I believe, participating in a mission of MPs that tabled an excellent report on how Canada could support the regional or sub-regional Esquipulas peace process in the very early 1990s. And I was happy to see an honorable mention of that experience in his book. And then we reconnected through a mutual friend and colleague, Brian Stevenson, in 1998 or so, when they invited me in to write a paper on how the human security lens could be used to kind of reframe approaches, multilateral approaches to the control of narcotics production, trade, and indeed consumption in the hemisphere. And I was so surprised that the senior minister actually read this rather voluminous paper. And he had not only read it, he had great questions about it. And we actually had a serious discussion with several colleagues on what Canada could reasonably expect from trying to engage other governments in the hemisphere as well as inter-American institutions on these issues. And so that really, when I read the book, I learned so much about the early childhood experiences, including in the church, that led to that kind of approach. Also about your experiences in the 1960s in civil rights movements and anti-war movements and so on. And it really helped me understand how even I'd noticed in the late 1990s, how you really, you were clearly approaching issues from a place of conviction, but also of concern to be effective in a world that is not, was not, and is not exactly the way we'd like it to be. It's far from ideal, and we often have to do business with people who have very different views, and they have to be persuaded. They have to be brought to the table. They have to be persuaded to sign on and then to implement. So I learned so much in reading this book, the first chapters about all of that experience. And also about so many things about the human security agenda that I didn't know of, that I wasn't party of, and not surprising, the immense frustrations of seeing a lot of that agenda. Some of it continued, but a lot of it was abandoned, jettisoned after 9/11, or instrumentalized. The same language was used, but to do completely different things. And so that was something we could certainly relate to. So that said, the chapters that really stood out for me were the last ones that are not actually about foreign policy, where foreign policy is put, in a sense, minimized a little bit to focus on domestic policy issues in which you were involved before coming to Ottawa then, and of course in returning to Winnipeg to lead the University of Winnipeg. And so the chapters on reckonings and the proposition for Canada that you highlighted in the last minutes of your introduction really moved me. And so I'm going to say a few things about those chapters and put aside my foreign policy wonk hat for a few minutes too, if I may. So first, I'm really convinced by the argument that Canada cannot move forward without fully acknowledging the legacies of internal colonialism, discrimination, and multiple ongoing forms of severe violence against Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I'm equally compelled by your arguments about the need to transform Canada's current approach, which still rests far too much on bureaucratic and judicial obstruction by the federal government on key files like land claims or Indigenous self-government. Rests also on a dogged defense of unsustainable oil, gas, and mineral extraction practices by some provincial governments and, of course, by private enterprises and their associations. And rests also on the complacency of even well-meaning citizens. You don't spare anybody, and that's really important for all of us, right? Because this is a common legacy we really have to address together. I'm really even more moved by the visionary agenda you outline in the last chapter that places indigenization at the heart of a program. You don't call it this, but I think it's fair to call it a social democratic. You call it liberal democratic. I think there's a strong tinge of social democracy to your liberalism, and that's okay, I think. With three key components. This is for Canada. First, the urgent implementation of the vast majority of pending recommendations by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chaired by the late Murray Sinclair, as well as by the Commission on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, combined with a bold movement towards Indigenous self-government that rests on a recognition of Indigenous people as the third pillar of our country, along with settler, Francophone, and Anglophone peoples. Second, the integration of Indigenous persons and their distinct knowledges in the new approaches to public service provision and public goods such as water, education, health, policing, international affairs. In areas like Arctic security, or mitigation of climate change. As Lloyd said towards the end, we have a lot to learn. Indigenous people wouldn't claim to have all the solutions, but we do have a lot to learn from their approach to stewardship and the specific knowledge of specific territories and lands and ecosystems to inform our policies and shape new approaches. Third, being aware, and this is, I thought, the most, at this time, most interesting, but also, issue worth needing of discussion today and beyond, is that knowing that these ideas and profound reforms are likely to elicit pushback in Canada and internationally. Of course, now with the imminent return of President Trump in the USA and the possible election of Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives as the next PM and ruling party of Canada, Lloyd recommends that we launch a process of deliberative democracy to foster public engagement in a serious discussion of strategic options in these various domains. And he sees that exercise in which parliaments, schools, universities, museums, and the media could play key roles as the fuel that could generate the political will to actually adopt far-reaching reforms, to implement those reforms entailed by this notion of deep indigenization. He frames those processes as crucial to regaining the confidence and trust of citizens, particularly of youth, the ones who will have to take these major changes forward in practice in order to make Canada and indeed the world's development sustainable. Of course, there are valid questions about those propositions. If I understood Lloyd a little bit from our interactions past and more recent, he would welcome discussion on these issues. He'd be disappointed if we only praised him. And so it's in that spirit that I end with a few questions. First, since it has reneged on promises like electoral reform and given the delicate balance inside the Liberal Party today, is the current federal government likely to embrace or even participate in such a deliberative process necessary for structural reforms? That's today. If not, can the deliberative process be launched by civil society and by sympathetic governments like the one of Premier Canoe, in Manitoba, just as we did with the Lineman's campaign in the 1980s? It was a civil society initiative, before the necessary support from government, from leaders like Lloyd Axworthy. And finally, how could that initiative be designed to survive the likely election of the Conservative Party next year in a context where it's not just a party, it's not just Mr. Poilievre. Canada also has its share of right-wing activists and social media trolls and people who will finance them with millions, if not more, of dollars, as we saw in the truckers' convoy during the pandemic. How to create deliberative democracy, and in fact, the man has a tension between deliberative democracy and the very reality of the difficulties of doing that in the current age, given those actors and their substantial resources. So there's no easy answers to these questions, obviously. I hope that we can discuss them a little bit today and come back to them over and over in the coming weeks, the coming months. Tell your friends to read this book. Invite them to a discussion about it, especially the last chapters, which are about the future, right? Because if we don't act now, and particularly those of us who are passing the torch, then it's not only our future, it's actually, let's remember, it's our children's future and it's our children's children's future that depend on us addressing these issues responsibly soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Before Lloyd, you may want to answer Stephen's questions. I think I would really like to open it up to the floor too. Lloyd has kindly agreed to have a few moments for the questions from the floor. So who wants to go ahead? I think we have enough in the, yeah, go ahead, yes.
Oh, thank you. My name is Dennis Kowalski. I'm, I guess, started out as a farm boy from Saskatchewan. I'm no longer living there. I still own some land there, but I had the privilege in 1993 of voting for Mr. Axworthy when I lived in Winnipeg. And it was actually a very tricky time. I was actually moving out of Winnipeg at the time. And I wanted to vote for him, and the ballots weren't out. The ballots weren't out yet. The pre-voting wasn't available yet. So I had to go to Elections Canada, and on a piece of paper, I had to write Mr. Axworthy's name on that paper in order to vote for Mr. Axworthy. And I had always affectionately referred to Mr. Axworthy as the true Pink Floyd. You know, I'm a Rolling Stone fan, but he's the true Pink Floyd, and no doubt about it. So anyways, I was and to this date, I do not regret that I voted for Mr. Axworthy. I'm very proud of that fact. But I only voted for you once. So but I've voted for the other Liberals all the time. So believe me. I had also had the privilege of meeting a colleague of Mr. Axworthy, who I met here at the Ukrainian embassy, and then I met him at the farmers' meetings in Ukraine. Unfortunately, he has now passed. Your former colleague, Mr. Gennady Udavenko, former foreign minister of Ukraine. And when I met him in Kyiv at the farmers' meetings, all he would talk to me about was what a wonderful relationship he had with Mr. Axworthy and the high praise. And it was really a privilege for me to see you in 2019 heading up the election observation mission in Ukraine. I had a few problems with your report, but I can let you go on that. So, but anyways, my question to you is, I'm a Saskatchewan farm boy, still have some farmland out there, but I have difficulty visiting there because, like, I have relatives that would vote for Trump. My own sister believes that Trump would have prevented the war in Ukraine. I have people in my family who are they've gone totally libertarian. They oppose taxes even for the school tax for education. Like what has happened? What has happened out there? You know, I always thought I left there because of the weather, but I guess when I reflect, I left there because of the people too, you know. So anyways, what in your opinion has happened in places like, say, I grew up under T.C. Douglas, Medicare, this kind of stuff. I came of age under Trudeau, you know, and I used to vote for Trudeau in Saskatchewan, and you know, much to the chagrin of many people. But anyways, what in your opinion has happened in Western Canada? And also, and I commend you for mentioning the word genocide in your presentation, because that is happening in the world today in too many places, and especially in Ukraine, where I was just recently. So I look forward to you answered your.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take two questions at a time. So the gentleman at the back, and then perhaps you can answer both questions.
Okay.
If you keep it a short question too, because we want to get others.
Sorry?
Keep it short because we want to get many people.
For sure. I'll go right to the second question then. My name is Mahmoud Ibrahim. I'm a third-year student here doing the Poli-Sci and Public Administration program. So I guess first I just wanted to say, like, thank you for your service, because, like, you're proof that Canada has a major role to play in international affairs. And that's something I truly believe in. Going straight to the question, I worry that our position, and when I say our position, I mean like the collective West's position in Palestine, is very damaging for us and for liberal values. So I'm originally from Eritrea, and I've seen personally the difference between a very totalitarian state and a democratic state. And obviously I would rather live here any time of the day. But I worry that we're going to lose our ability to advocate for human rights and the right to protect and these values that are so ingrained because coming from where I'm from, people are not really believing that the West cares about human rights and advocacy and stuff like that. So I guess my question would be, why do you think that we've retreated in that role in terms of, let's say, advocating for human rights in Palestine or something like that? And do you believe that Canada can play a large role in solving the conflict in Palestine, given that we have a huge, Jewish diaspora, a huge Palestinian diaspora, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you.
Thank you. Lloyd, do you want to answer both questions?
Well, thank you both for that very easy set of questions. Let me first establish bonding with two Saskatchewan boys who are together in the room and share the same kind of perplexity about what's happened in Saskatchewan. I do write about it a little bit in the book, and I go back to Dale Eisler's book that was written 4 or 5 years ago. Saskatchewan has fundamentally changed its economy. It used to be the small farm co-op, help your neighbors build a barn, and the Co-op Federation was an incredibly powerful community organization. Doesn't exist anymore. Farms have become industrial, big, and really designed to provide export crops without sort of putting roots in the community. But that's been enhanced a lot by government policy. Where's the school? Where's the hospital? Where's the local green elevator? So as we have sort of consolidated and corporized everything, the smaller parts of our country are being ignored. And to go back to what Stephen pointed out, I say our electoral system doesn't really provide fair representation. The first past the post system, and I went through 9 elections and so benefited from that. But I also see right now that in Western Canada there's it's an either or. It's a rural-urban split, and that is becoming one of the great divides, not just in Canada, but right around the world. And the problem is that the federal government of Canada, under both Liberal and Conservative administrations, treated the prairie provinces as flyover country. I mean, we sold off the wheat board. We canceled the grain commission. We changed the Crow's Rest Net Past issue. Perhaps the most effective Crown agency that we had, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Agency, which helped farmers in the prairies develop water and conserve water and develop immigration on a sustainable basis, was shut down. Why? There was no reason about its efficiency. It was just happened to be a Crown corporation. And we went through this period of neoliberalism in the 80s and the 90s, and even much of it now, where neoliberalism said it's the market that decides and that governments are useless. And we still have a hangover from that. And it's been sort of reflected then into the governance and politics, which meant, though, that we began to, the federal governments of whatever shapes have very little to do now. And what do they do in Western Canada? Well, they provide a lot of money by transfer and tax points to help pay for the healthcare systems and for other things, but there is absolutely no identity. There's no presence, there's no rooting. And so people just simply think that they are being ignored. And in fact, they are. And for a period of time, I was the only elected Liberal in Western Canada. And that in itself is a story. But it also meant that I was kind of in the crossfire between federal governments that got their majorities in Ontario and Quebec and said we can become a government without having to be concerned. And I, at one point in the book, tell about how in one of the campaigns, the calculations of the gurus in Toronto who are managing the campaign said I had absolutely no chance of being elected until and this is a funny part of the book, is I recruited two up-and-coming Manitobans. One was Angus Reid, who became the pollster and is now, let's just say, very prominent. And a guy named Peter Stringham, who worked for a small ad agency and a few years ago ended up he was the president of the largest ad agency in the world. I keep saying, what did I do wrong in my life? But they were able, we basically ran our own campaign. We did not buy into the sort of the what we'd call there the Ontario-based sort of standards. So there's been a lot of these things that slowly and surely have created those kinds of grievances. And of course, it's fueled up by the changing nature of our media. I mean, if you used to be in Saskatchewan, the Regina Leader Post was your kind of guiding light. Now it's some influencer who probably lives in Miami that tells people in Saskatchewan what they should believe about evangelical Christian nationalism. So the world has changed very directly. The counter to it, I go back to the points, and I'm glad, Stephen, for mentioning, is that in some ways we have to develop a different track, a second or third track that isn't sort of reliable just on our existing institutions, but is the kind of thing I was attending this summer, a thing called the Victoria Forum, where 500 or 600 people on the island get together from all walks of life, and for 5 days talk about public policy. There's political people there, but they aren't sort of the front and center. They're listening, and all of a sudden there's a way of making decisions. And increasingly, I'm finding that the territorial government of the Yukon now has a cross-party deliberative process going on to change the election system in the territories. So step by step, we're beginning to find there's some different ways of doing democracy. And it does go back, I mean, my own, as you know, in the book, I was part of the kind of community organizing stuff, the Saul Alinsky things of the 60s and 70s. And I just really feel that if you give people that opportunity to make decisions, then it's going to be the best control and restraint on power. So I wish it was otherwise in Saskatchewan, but I mean, liberalism is not dead, but it's certainly in life support. And it's partly because the political managers of the Liberal Party of Canada simply have written off Western Canada as being a source of support. And that's just a hard reality. And as a result, they pay a price for it, and they will pay a price in the coming election. On the bigger question, I think I have a suggestion for you. And it's not because I simply want to fall back on something, but about 3 months ago, there was a professor of international relations at Carleton, Michael McCulloch, and Alan Rock, who's a friend of mine, and I wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs magazine, which is one of the prominent journals. And we talked about how the way to begin to address this kind of the huge divide and of what's happening in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza is to really turn it back to proper administration by the UN Trusteeship Council. Now it was one of the major councils set up in 1945-46, Security Council, the Economic Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. It managed the transfer of colonial territories to become independent governments, and succeeded, because it did have the responsibility of bringing international involvement, helping to set up sort of generic indigenous-based governments, and step by step, they became their own sort of autonomy and their own ability to govern. And simply saying, but you have a case where the UN has the people at the UN have kind of forgotten a little bit about those kinds of successes that they had, the trusteeship council is on the shelf. It's not used for anything. And yet it's fully powered under the UN Charter. And secondly is that you have, again, a wide variety of political leaders around the world who get off in dissing the United Nations as opposed to working with it. And frankly, our own country has become, let me just say, a passive participant in the UN. We're not really engaged. Bob Rae is a good ambassador, but he doesn't have any game plan coming from home office in Ottawa. And so the kind of things that we talked about in terms of the UN, we're just not doing. We just go along, don't get into trouble, don't ruffle feathers. In the meantime, I mean, I took great, well, I chair an NGO called the the Council of Migration and Refugees. And when UNRWA was under attack, we said, for goodness sake, how else are you going to provide the humanitarian aid? Well, now UNRWA is basically sort of, again, shelved. Who's doing the humanitarian aid right now? Nobody. I mean, the level of aid, there was a story today, has dropped by 60% in the last 7 or 8 months. So people are starving. So you're saying, and that's not taking sides on, I mean, because I mean, Hamas attack was horrendous. It broke every law, rule, norm, standard, ethic in the book. But in the meantime, is the solution being applied going to succeed? I don't think so. And I think that's why we have to have an international focus. And we circulated we got a lot of good comment from people about the trusteeship council, except from our own government. So.
Thank you. So we have time just for one, possibly 2 questions left. So one for the gentleman and then one from you. And we have to leave it at that for the moment. Yeah, we got 2.
Hi, Lloyd. Nice to see you again, and you, Errol, and nice to meet a couple of others. I'm actually going to use the mic to turn the attention to, there's a question online. So I don't know if we have control over that, but there is a question online if that can be raised.
So you don't have a question?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to make sure that it was seen.
Sure. Okay, great.
Unheard voices.
Okay, so I don't know whether someone knows what the question is because we don't have access. In the meanwhile, the gentleman over there does have a question, so.
Thanks. My name is John Katsopoulos. I'm at Global Affairs Canada. We met for a micro moment at the train station. Just a few days ago. Yeah. I had a myriad of questions, but I'll just keep it very, very quick. In fact, I'm interested in the mechanics of foreign policy making. Obviously, eras are different that you operated in. But your point, actually, your last one resonated with me. And it's simply this, what you mentioned, that the game plan coming from Ottawa to our missions abroad is perhaps not as maybe to yours up at the same standards that once were. So maybe you can comment on that. And I have to do a quick follow-up because I see Fen Hampson's name on the front of your book. And I've heard this a lot, given I try to straddle academia and policy making. And I know that in your time at DFATE, you held court with academics in a kind of Chatham House way, from what I understand. I know that doesn't exist anymore. So I would like some of your comments on that as well, foreign policy making and straddling the policy academia divide.
So before, actually, Lloyd, perhaps you can answer the question because we're still waiting to know what the question is from upstairs.
Sure. I want to use your question to make a comment that I haven't really addressed, and that is one of the, I think, weaknesses, one of the sort of erosions that we've had is in that old concept called ministerial responsibility. Ministers are not given a lot of room or discretion. And that means that they have far less responsibility to govern their ministries. And there is a chapter in the book that you might find interesting where he said that it was, I certainly learned the craft of politics and the wheeling and dealing and the inner game. But when I became a minister, I learned that I had to understand how that ministry worked. So I had to kind of gear down and kind of become, I guess, an apprentice on the actual mechanics of how do you make something work? What levers do you pull? What resources do you need? How do you get people mobilized? And but one of the things that I think we were able to bring to the table at that time is that we were then called External Affairs. We had our own think tank inside the department, Stephen, and it was a group of Foreign Service officers, some academics who would regularly, I would say, hey, I used the example in the book about North Korea. Should we talk about North Korea? Well, they did consultations, they did research, they came back and said, here's some propositions. So we weren't waiting for some kind of burning bush or bolt of lightning. We were manufactured just the same way, as I said earlier. We tried to put together our own multilateral organizations to get things done. And we just had the confidence we could do it because we had the people. And that is the other side of the equation, is that successive Canadian governments, step by step, have sort of abrogated proper funding and support for foreign policy, diplomacy, defense, and international development. You know, part of our system is if you can't win votes, you're not going to do it. But the stupidity of that, and I'll be blunt, of those who make that decision, is that if you do good things internationally, Canadians respond. They want their country to be effective. They want to have that sense of we're managing immigration. They want to understand that our role at the UN has a presence to it. But the kind of, I find it coming back to Ottawa, and after I retired, we went back out west. So I just came back with my wife a year and a half ago because we have grandchildren here. And I'm finding this kind of a town that is full of sort of public affairs groups and lobbyists who all say, oh, poo on international stuff is what really counts, is, you know, what we're lobbying for. But nobody lobbies, you know, for diplomacy. And as a result, the Treasury Board and others, they have a program review where they apply the same category to the to global affairs, you know, as they do to the Department of Finance or to the delivery departments. You can't do it. I mean, you can't. You don't have the resources, and that's a huge failure. And the only way you correct that again is you have to have people in leadership positions who say this counts. And I had the great benefit of working with Prime Minister Chrétien because he was a liberal internationalist, and in fact I had a call from him this morning. He'd also read the book, and says, "Oh yeah," he says, "yeah, we were good partners, eh? Oh, all right." And he said to me, I quote in the book, is that when we had a conversation about the landmine treaty, and that we were going to make this kind of cheeky decision to actually invite countries back to Canada to sign the treaty. And he says, well, if it works, I get the credit. If it doesn't work, you look for a new job.
So Lloyd,
yes.
At the risk of even asking you to answer this, because it's going to take a long time to answer this. But anyway, the question from the online is, I have a quick question. It's not a quick question about political tensions, specifically around Canada's and China. What would be some of the advice on having a better relationship with China, as political tensions of the two countries have worsened over the years? And I've heard that this would be detrimental to Canada as well. What would be the experience and tensions of China taking Hong Kong back? Try and answer as much as you can, because keep it short if you want to, because Ellen will kill me. That we need time so people can go to the back and buy the books, and you can sign it. So feel free to answer the question, and then we'll call it a quits, because we have to get some of the books bought and signed. Go for it.
Well, I think my basic instinct is that there are so many important relationships that you can't allow to fail, that you have to continue working at. And that doesn't mean that you endorse or buy into their actions, I mean, I do talk in the book about my effort, not very successfully, to engage Cuba in this issue, because but I thought it was an important sort of to have them in the American system, inter-American system. And I think we're also reaching that case with India. I have a piece in the Hill Times today saying that we are running into this kind of head-on crash with India, and you can't afford to do that. I'm not saying that you condone what they did. You don't, and you kick them out. But you, at the same time, you start some two-track dialogues. You get people talking on the areas otherwise. And to go back to the China issue, I think that there are some key issues in which, let's talk about climate for one, where there is some we have to develop some common ground. So we have the big meeting in Azerbaijan. We should be really, we should have been working the China file very hard in terms of what would they contribute to the adaptation of in southern countries of the impacts of climate change. Look, those are the places where we choose where we can have an impact, and it doesn't mean to say that. But our politics is that: are you for it or against it? And I was involved as a foreign minister in the negotiation when the United Kingdom decided to pull out of Hong Kong. We had close to 300,000 dual citizens, Canadian citizens, who also were Hong Kong citizens. My job was to try to negotiate with the Chinese to protect that right of dual citizenship, which we did for a long period until recently. But you're dealing with an autocrat. You're dealing with a system of autocracy where the autocrats get together and they want to destroy our system. Let's be realistic. Let's be about it. I go back to the old George Kennan notion of his essay: contain it, stop it, deal with it, but don't get on a barricade and they say beat your breast about how awful it is. Do things that really counter what's going on, and we need to explore those issues. There is an institute at the University of Alberta that works on China study and tries to manufacture these two-track arrangements. And I think we should be supporting that and engaging it. We have a really important diaspora of Chinese Canadians. Get them involved. I mean, diplomacy is not, standing up in the House of Commons and giving a statement or showing up at some international meeting. You have to really work the ground. You really do have to. And that's as important in diplomacy as anything else. You have to work the ground. And I just don't think we're doing that very well. And maybe because I think we so badly weaken our capacity to do it.
Thank you, Lloyd. So again, on behalf of everyone who's come and also online, and thank you for the questioner. He's been very patient. So let's thank Lloyd for very much for coming here. He's done this several times now, so it does take a lot of energy to come yet again. So on behalf of all of you, let's thank Lloyd a lot. Thank you.